In the medieval world, forests were more than stretches of wilderness. They were living storehouses of fuel, building material, and food. Among the people who depended most heavily on these vast woodlands were the woodcutters, men whose daily labour supplied villages, castles, monasteries and towns with the timber that sustained medieval life. Though they rarely appear in grand chronicles or royal histories, woodcutters formed an essential link between nature and society. Their work was demanding, dangerous, and often lonely, carried out deep within forests that could be both generous and unforgiving. Most medieval woodcutters lived in small rural communities situated near large forested areas. Some were peasants who farmed during the warmer months and cut wood in the colder seasons, while others specialised entirely in forestry work. Their lives followed the rhythm of the natural world. The rising of the sun marked the beginning of their labour, and the fading light of evening signalled the end of a long day. Unlike craftsmen working inside town workshops, woodcutters spent nearly every working hour outdoors, exposed to the weather and the unpredictable forces of the forest. The day often began before dawn. In the dim light of early morning, a woodcutter prepared his tools and provisions. His most important instrument was the axe, usually made of iron with a wooden handle carefully shaped for balance and strength. Some woodcutters also carried wedges, wooden mallets, and saws. These tools were precious possessions, often maintained and repaired over many years. A well-made axe could determine the speed and safety of a worker's labour. After gathering their equipment, woodcutters travelled into the forest. Sometimes they walked alone, but often they moved in small groups for safety and efficiency. Forest paths were narrow and uneven, and reaching a cutting site could take hours. In regions where forests belonged to a lord or monastery, woodcutters worked under permission or obligation. Certain areas were designated for cutting, while others were protected to ensure that the woodland could regenerate. Once inside the forest, the atmosphere changed. Towering trees blocked much of the sunlight, and the ground was covered with leaves, roots, and fallen branches. The forest was alive with sounds, the call of birds, the rustling of animals, and the distant cracking of branches in the wind. For woodcutters, these sounds were part of everyday life. They learned to read the forest carefully, recognizing signs of weather changes, animal movements, or unstable trees. The work itself required patience and skill. Felling a tree was not simply a matter of striking it repeatedly with an axe. A woodcutter needed to study the tree's shape, the direction of its lean, and the surrounding space. If a tree fell incorrectly, it could damage valuable timber or cause serious injury. The woodcutter, therefore, cut a notch into one side of the trunk to guide its fall. With rhythmic swings of the axe, chips of wood flew through the air as the trunk slowly weakened. The sound of axes striking wood echoed through the forest. It was a steady rhythm, repeated hour after hour. The physical effort was enormous. Swinging a heavy axe required strength in the arms, shoulders, and back. Over time, woodcutters developed muscular bodies and remarkable endurance. Their hands were often hardened by calluses, and their clothes carried the scent of wood and sap. When the final cuts were made, the tree would begin to creak and shift. Woodcutters listened carefully for the warning sounds that signalled the moment of collapse. With a loud cracking noise, the tree would fall to the ground, shaking nearby branches and scattering leaves. The moment was both satisfying and dangerous. A falling tree could easily kill anyone standing too close. After the tree was felled, the work continued. Branches had to be removed, a process known as limbing. The trunk was then cut into sections suitable for transport. These logs could serve many purposes. Some would become firewood, fueling the hearths of homes and bakeries. Others were destined for construction, eventually forming the beams of houses, barns, or castle structures. Transporting the wood was often the most exhausting part of the process. Large logs were heavy and difficult to move. In some areas, woodcutters relied on oxen or horses to drag timber along forest paths. In other places, they rolled logs by hand using wooden levers and teamwork. Rivers and streams sometimes served as natural highways. Logs could be floated downstream toward towns where carpenters and builders awaited them. The medieval economy depended heavily on this steady supply of timber. Wood was the primary fuel for heating, cooking, and metalworking. Blacksmiths required charcoal made from carefully burned wood to heat their forges. Builders used timber for frameworks, roofs, doors, and scaffolding. Even ships and carts relied on strong wooden components. Without the labour of woodcutters, many aspects of medieval life would have been impossible. Despite its importance, woodcutting was rarely an easy profession. Forest labour carried constant risks. One of the greatest dangers came from falling trees and branches. A misjudged cut or unexpected gust of wind could turn a routine task into a deadly accident. Injuries from axes were also common, particularly during long hours of work when fatigue reduced concentration. Weather added another layer of difficulty. In summer, woodcutters endured heat, insects, and thick undergrowth. In winter, they faced freezing temperatures, snow-covered ground, and slippery conditions. Yet winter was often the busiest time for woodcutting. Frozen ground made it easier to transport heavy logs, and the reduced foliage allowed workers to move more easily among the trees. Wild animals also inhabited the forests. While large predators were relatively rare in many regions by the late Middle Ages, wolves and bears still existed in certain areas. More commonly, woodcutters encountered deer, wild boar, and smaller creatures. These animals were usually more afraid of humans than the other way around, but unexpected encounters could still be frightening. Meals during the workday were simple. Woodcutters carried bread, cheese, onions, or dried meat in small bags. They might pause around midday to rest and eat near a fallen log or clearing. Fresh water came from nearby streams. These short breaks were essential for restoring strength before returning to the demanding labour of cutting and hauling timber. Woodcutters often developed a deep familiarity with the forest environment. Over years of experience, they learned which trees produced the best timber and which areas were most suitable for harvesting. Oak, for example, was highly valued for its strength and durability. Pine and fir were easier to cut and useful for many construction purposes. Knowledge of these differences made experienced woodcutters valuable members of their communities. Some woodcutters worked seasonally, combining forestry with agriculture. During planting and harvest seasons they helped in the fields, but when farming slowed, they returned to the forest. Others were employed by noble estates or monasteries, where forest management became an organised activity. Monastic communities in particular maintained detailed rules about how and where trees could be cut to preserve long-term supplies. The forest was not only a workplace, but also a place surrounded by stories and beliefs. Medieval people often viewed deep woodlands with a mixture of respect and fear. Folklore spoke of spirits, strange creatures, or hidden dangers lurking among the trees. For woodcutters who spent their days in these environments, such tales were part of the cultural atmosphere of the forest, though practical concerns usually mattered more than superstition. At the end of the day, as the sun lowered behind the treetops, woodcutters gathered their tools and began the journey back to their villages. The return trip could be tiring, especially after hours of heavy labour, yet there was satisfaction in seeing the results of their work, neatly stacked logs or cleared spaces where new growth would eventually appear. Evenings were often spent repairing tools, sharpening axe blades, or preparing for the next day's work. Maintaining equipment was essential. A dull axe required more effort and increased the risk of accidents. Woodcutters therefore took pride in caring for their tools, much as a knight might care for his sword. Life for woodcutters was not wealthy or glamorous. Their homes were simple, their clothing practical, and their days filled with physical effort. Yet their role was fundamental to the functioning of medieval society. Every warm hearth, sturdy roof beam, and glowing forge depended on the timber they harvested. Over generations, the labour of woodcutters shaped the landscape of Europe. Forests were gradually cleared to make room for farms, villages, and roads. At the same time, many communities recognized the need to manage forests carefully. Rules emerged to limit overcutting and ensure that trees could regrow. In this way, woodcutters became not only harvesters of timber, but also participants in early forms of environmental stewardship. When modern people imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture castles, knights, and kings. Yet beyond those symbols of power lay the quieter world of workers whose labour sustained everyday life. Among them, woodcutters stood as silent providers, transforming the raw strength of forests into the materials that built medieval civilization. Their daily routine, waking before dawn, entering the shadowed forest, swinging the axe through long hours of labour, and returning home at sunset, was repeated countless times across centuries. It was a life shaped by endurance, skill, and an intimate connection with nature. Though their names rarely appear in historical records, the legacy of medieval woodcutters survives in the timber-framed buildings, ancient ships, and rural traditions that remain today. Each beam and plank tells a quiet story of the men who once stood deep in the forests, listening to the echo of their axes and watching great trees fall beneath the patient rhythm of their work.